Our first presentation is called the Chaparral Primer, 10 Things Every Citizen Should Know About Chaparral. Actually, it's 10 things we think that every citizen should know about Chaparral, by Nicole Molinari and moi. And Nicole and I are going to tag team. So I'm going to introduce Nicole first. Nicole is the province ecologist for the Southern California province of the U.S. Forest Service's Pacific Southwest region, which is the Los Padres National Forest, the Angeles National Forest, the San Bernardino National Forest, and the Cleveland National Forest. And although she gave me a little list of the things she thinks she's an expert at everything. Because people in this job have to know absolutely everything, and she does. And I'm so proud to note that I hired this woman in 2014, maybe? 2013, 14, I think it was. And wow, one of the best hires I've ever made. You are amazing, and I'm proud to be up here with you. So anyway,
you.
Okay, you're up.
Wow. Good afternoon, everyone. It's so nice to see all your faces. Some of my favorite people are here in this room today, so this is really exciting for me. And to kick this Chaparral Symposium off, Hugh and I have identified 10 things we think every Californian should know about Chaparral. And it was not easy to come up with this list. And I feel like we're really just hitting the tip of the iceberg here. But we thought that these 10 things were foundational and also topics that we could grow over the next few days as we continue to discuss Chaparral. Okay, so number one, we wanted to provide a broad perspective. And we want everyone to know that Mediterranean ecosystems across the globe are somewhat rare. And so we find these Mediterranean ecosystems in places with a Mediterranean climate. Mediterranean climates are characterized as having cool, wet winters and warm, dry summers. These are places where people like to congregate. Just look at housing prices here in California. That's same for many of these Mediterranean places around the globe. These are also places where shrublands and shrubs thrive. And so these 5 locations, California, Central Chile, the Cape of South Africa, Southwest Australia, and the Mediterranean Basin are all characteristic of these Mediterranean ecosystems. And I like to think of these Mediterranean ecosystems as being small and mighty. They make up about 2% of our land base, but they also host 1/6 of all terrestrial plant species. And so these Mediterranean ecosystems have been identified as global biodiversity hotspots because of their biological richness, their limited geographical extent, as well as their severe threats from humans. And so next time you're out in the Chaparral, I know being here in California, for me, I live in Southern California, and Chaparral can seem vast. You look out across these Chaparral landscapes and you see shrubs as far as the eye can see. But I think it's important to step back and recognize the rarity of this ecosystem type, especially within a global context. Okay, point number 2. Chaparral has many shapes, sizes, forms, and people have actually classified Chaparral into about 45 different vegetation types. Over the next few days, we are not going to be talking about all 45 vegetation types, but I just want to point out that we will be talking about some types and not about others. So, for example, we have montane chaparral. This chaparral is found above the snow line. It has unique species that are not found at lower elevation. It's early successional to conifer forest, and there will not be any speakers over the next few days talking about montane chaparral. It's just a different beast. What we will be spending a lot of time talking about is lower elevation chaparral. And lower elevation chaparral has been divided up into a number of different vegetation types, sometimes based on soil. You might hear people talking about serpentine chaparral. It's sometimes identified based on geography. We have Mike Vasey and Claudia Tyler who will be talking about maritime chaparral, that chaparral that hugs the coastline and is found in the fog belt. We also have chaparral that's identified based on the species dominance. So shimmy chaparral, scrub oak chaparral. And in general, the chaparral types, regardless of soil geography, most of them are impenetrable, almost impossible to walk through, and they're made up of evergreen, small, thick-leaved shrubs. We will spend some time too over the next few days talking about coastal sage scrub, and many people term this soft chaparral. We have Robert Fisher and Frank Davis who will be talking about fire in these coastal sage scrub ecosystems. They tend to be at lower elevation, tend to be heavily impacted by development because they exist in the coastal plains. They're made up of aromatic, really good smelling subshrubs, and they tend to occur in drier sites. So many of the species within coastal sage scrub are drought deciduous. They drop their leaves in the summertime. And oftentimes, coastal sage scrub will integrate with chaparral, it could be early successional to chaparral, and Hugh will spend some time later talking about that mosaic between chaparral, sage scrub, grassland, and woodlands. All right, moving on to point number 3. Chaparral burns in stand replacing crown fires. And these crown fires can be vast. They can go for miles and miles. And oftentimes you might look at a picture like this and think, good grief, how can this ecosystem type recover? And what's really cool about chaparral is recovery is intrinsic. Everything that this ecosystem needs to recover is right there in front of you. And so there are 4 post-fire regeneration strategies that allow for this recovery in these high-intensity burn areas. And here they are. I'm going to talk about each one, give you a little bit of background so you have a better understanding of these 4 post-fire regeneration types. So first off, we have fire followers. These fire followers are annual wildflowers. You rarely see them in intact stands of chaparral. They exist as a dormant seed bank, and following fire, their seeds are triggered to germinate from a number of different cues. Fire cues, heat cues, and following fire, there's a pulse of diversity of these fire followers. They're usually on the landscape for 2 or 3 years. By 5 years, they're almost completely gone, and you don't see them again. They're dormant in the soil for decades until the next fire rolls through. The next 3 groups I'm going to talk about are post-fire regeneration strategies focused on the woody component, on the shrub component. So we have obligate cedars. These obligate cedars are completely killed by fire, and they germinate in a similar fashion to the fire followers. They're present as dormant, their seeds are dormant in the seed bank, and they are triggered to germinate in the same way as our lovely post-fire wildflowers. I think that the obligate cedar group will get a lot of attention over the next few days because this is a group that is susceptible to something called immaturity risk. And so these obligate cedars are slow to grow, they're slow to mature, and even once they mature and start producing seed, it takes quite some time for them to establish a seed bank. And so if another fire or disturbance comes in to this ecosystem, it is possible that the obligate cedars will be extirpated, at least locally. And one of the reasons that this is really important is that they're a major contributor to diversity. So some of our rare manzanitas, actually many of our rare manzanitas and our rare species fall within this obligate seeding group. And there will be quite a bit of time spent by John Keeley talking about obligate cedars and the time needed for them to reestablish seed banks. Okay, we have obligate sprouters. So obligate sprouters have the above ground vegetation removed by fire. Their seeds are killed by fire, but they're able to come back through sprouting of their roots and burls. And so oftentimes as you walk through chaparral ecosystems immediately after fire, it can be 1 or 2 weeks after fire, you already see green tufts coming from the base of the shrubs, and those are obligate sprouters. And 2 characteristic or well-known obligate sprouters are scrub oak and toyon. And lastly, we have facultative cedars. These are sort of the lucky duckies that are able to do both. They can seed and resprout, and our most abundant shrub in California chaparral, chamise, falls into this obligate cedar category. All right, so the take home here is that intact chaparral, it may look simple, it may look homogeneous, but it's really not. It's highly speciose with hidden diversity that appears following fire. Okay, point number 4. This focuses on fire specifically and the fire regime within chaparral. So chaparral burns infrequently and at high severity. In order for recovery and this recovery process to happen, it's important that this fire regime is maintained. And so for this cycle of recovery, maturity, old growth, being prepared for the next fire to happen, there has to be maintenance of this fire regime. So prior to humans arriving in California, about 11,000 years ago, lightning was the only source of ignition. And lightning strike densities along the California coast are among the lowest in North America. And so the map you see here in blue shows lightning strike densities within the state. And you notice that they peak on the eastern edge, they peak at higher elevation, and they really peter out as you move down slope towards the coast. And the orange that you see on this map is where our chaparral and coastal sage scrub communities are. So really, historically, not a lot of lightning strikes. So fire was infrequent in these systems, and the historic fire return intervals were estimated, or are estimated, to be between 30 and 90 years. And these long fire-free periods are really important. It provides sufficient time for our obligate cedars to reestablish their seed bank before the next fire comes through. Here's another way to look at this. So this is a map of Southern California, the teal color are urban areas, and you can see that those are nestled right up against the chaparral ecosystems. And all the gray dots you see are ignitions that have occurred throughout Southern California over the last 30 years. And so, similar to the last map, you can tell that there aren't a lot of lightning ignitions or natural ignitions in these ecosystems. And over this 30-year period, there's about 20 lightning strikes in Southern California per year. And we contrast that to the red dots you now see on this map. This shows human ignitions in Southern California, specifically in chaparral habitats from 1992 to present. And these human ignitions are, when I looked at the number per year, they average in the hundreds. Some years actually have thousands of human ignitions. And these human ignitions are from all sorts of sources. So it could be vehicle, equipment, smoking, arson, pile burning. And there's a really wonderful paper that was written by Alexandra Seifert and John Keeley in 2018 that actually dig into the causes of ignition by county, cause of ignition by management unit. And so if you're interested in knowing what the major cause of ignition is in the area where you work, then you should definitely check out that paper. But all of this to say, when you look at this map, the point I want to make is that we have a serious ignition problem here in chaparral in Southern California. And Robert Fitch will be talking later today about strategies for reducing ignitions across this landscape. So our historical fire return interval, just as a reminder, is estimated to be between 30 and 90 years. Currently, in Southern California chaparral, 20%, a little bit over 1 million acres, has a fire return interval of less than 30 years. So we have too much fire in this ecosystem. Ignition reduction is really going to be key to not only protecting the chaparral, but protecting the neighboring communities that are right there next door to the chaparral. One last thing on fire. Many people confuse the fire regime in chaparral and montane forests. And I think that for the most part, this is pretty misunderstood. And so I just wanted to take a moment to make clear how these two fire regimes and these disparate vegetation types, what they look like in the past and what they look like now. So in chaparral, we've discussed this in the past. Fires were infrequent but high severity. Now with the onset of excessive human ignitions, 90% of our ignitions are from humans, we have too much fire in these ecosystems. In montane forests, fire was frequent. You saw the lightning strikes on the eastern part of our state, and fire in montane forests tend to burn at low severity. Today, because of fire suppression and cessation of Native American burning, we do not have enough fire in these landscapes. So as we start thinking about solutions for dealing with the wildfire problem, it's really important to put them in the context of the vegetation type and the issue that's really at hand. So we need to tailor those solutions appropriately. Okay, so my last bullet point before handing it over to Hugh is that with too much fire in these ecosystems, there's a risk of type conversion. And essentially what type conversion means is it's a state change. Going from a native, woody, diverse vegetation type with too much disturbance, with drought, with the inputs of non-native species, you can wind up in this non-native annual grass state. And so this represents an ecosystem change. These non-native annual grasses are disturbance tolerant, they're more drought tolerant, and they can persist on the landscape for quite some time. Because they cure early in the summertime and they're available to burn and they're easily ignitable, they can actually reinforce. So there's a positive feedback here, and they can reinforce these non-native grasslands on the landscape. So it's not very often that we see these non-native annual grasslands return to native shrublands if there's a lot of fire on the landscape. Okay, so a few years ago, well, I guess the last Chaparral Symposium was 6 years ago, you said, Hugh, we worked with Emma Underwood and the Forest Service to develop a chaparral video focused on ecosystem services. When these chaparral ecosystems are lost to type conversion, the ecosystem services go with it. And so this video, I think, captures well some of the ecosystem services that can be lost with type conversion.
Let's see if it works.
Let's see if it plays. I've never had a video in a presentation. I don't like stuff like this.
Well, it worked earlier, no?
Southern California boasts mountains and beautiful coastline with an easy reach for 22 million residents, as well as extensive wildlands available for the public to enjoy. Contained in the Los Padres, Angeles, San Bernardino, and Cleveland, these national forests protect 3.5 million acres of wildlands. Southern California has a Mediterranean-type climate, which is shared with only 4 other areas on Earth. They are all dominated by shrubland vegetation, characterized by plants with small, leathery leaves that reduce water loss in the hot, dry summers. In California, we know this shrubland as chaparral. In fact, contrary to their name, Southern California's national forests actually contain more chaparral shrubland than forest. Chaparral dominates the Southern California landscape and provides the scenic backdrop for many cities. However, despite its prevalence, chaparral is undervalued and underappreciated by people. As a result, it has experienced extensive development, fragmentation, and degradation. Despite people's perceptions, chaparral actually does provide many important things to people, things we call ecosystem services or nature's benefits. Chaparral delivers numerous services essential to our daily lives, our health, and even our survival. And consequently, they have an economic value that we might not be aware of. Carbon is stored in above and below ground material in plants. The more shrubland present, the greater the carbon storage. This helps regulate the warmth of the atmosphere and, of course, the same process releases the oxygen that we breathe. The 4 national forests provide almost 26 million metric tons of carbon storage worth $2.5 billion. This is equivalent to the emissions from 20 million vehicles a year. Water for cities and people, agriculture and industry is another service provided by healthy, functioning chaparral. Models estimate the amount of rainfall that flows over the landscape, which we call runoff, and the rainfall that infiltrates and moves down to the groundwater, called recharge. The 4 national forests provide over 1 trillion gallons of water per year, a service worth at least $9 billion. This is huge. It is equivalent to 100 years of drinking water for the entire population of California. Southern California is characterized by very steep mountains. The roots and above-ground parts of healthy chaparral and forests help hold soil and rocks in place. Without vegetation, eroded material from hillsides can cause serious damage, destroying houses, roads, and endangering lives. Vegetation in the 4 national forests help retain almost 17 million tons of sediment a year. The value of this service is represented by the cost of removing sediment from debris dams, service worth over $96 million a year. This would fill up almost 130,000 swimming pools. Given the large and growing population of Southern California, the national forests provide numerous opportunities for recreation and connecting with nature. These 4 national forests receive over 7 million visitors per year. The value to those who engage in different types of recreation at these 4 locations is over $500 million a year. Southern California, like the world's 4 other Mediterranean climate regions, is a global biodiversity hotspot. In fact, San Diego County is the most biodiverse county in the United States. There are 331 rare plants and animals in the Southern California forests, which also harbor critically important wildlife corridors. Interestingly, much of the plant diversity in Chaparral is only visible after it burns. Healthy chaparral landscapes are adapted to the natural fires that occur every 30 to 100 years, and in only 2 to 8 years, they can recover most ecosystem services. However, the high density of humans in some areas results in many more fires than even chaparral can tolerate. This leads to a lessening of services. Intact and healthy chaparral ecosystems have enormous value to people based on the ecosystem services they provide. The value provided by the public lands of Southern California underscores the importance of conservation and good stewardship of these often undervalued chaparral shrublands.
Technical problems.
How to turn it off?
Yeah.
You're going to have to watch a tape loop of this for the rest of the conference.
Okay, there we go. All right, Hugh. I'm passing over to Hugh for number 6 through 10.
That's right. Okay, let's pull that one up. Okay,
And I think we are notably ahead of schedule, so let's see. So in order to move this, I just hit the return button, is that correct?
oh, there's a clicker. I'm going to use that too because I've got my notes over here. Okay, so anyway, number 6. Number 6 is humans shouldn't build structures in chaparral. But we've always done it, and once we've done it, we're sort of committed to protecting those structures, right? Today, about half of California's population lives in areas that once supported or continue to support sage scrub or chaparral. It's kind of amazing that there's so many people in that area. Remember that Native American homes were typically built of thatch or wood, and modern Californian homes are also mostly built of wood. They're very flammable. So here's a graphic that we just threw together the other day showing that actually 21.3 million Californians are living in formerly sage scrub or chaparral habitat as of 2010. And a healthy proportion of these people continue to live adjacent to shrubland fuels. And here's a graphic showing what happens when human homes and infrastructure intersect on a hot and windy day. These photos are all from California, but they could just as easily be from Greece or Portugal or Chile or Australia or anywhere else in a semi-arid, fire-prone landscape. Okay, let's see. All right, number 7, chaparral can't get no love. One of the reasons that we started this event was because chaparral can't get no love. And I mean, really on the surface, and this is another reason also that we did that video, right? So on the surface, chaparral doesn't actually really seem very useful to humans, and they have always tried to reduce its prevalence on the landscape. And here are a couple of examples in the slide of chaparral torture devices. As you probably know, the principal management tool of Native Americans was fire, and they used it extensively to manage chaparral and other shrublands. They did this to promote, among other things, food sources, construction and basketry materials, habitat for game, safer village sites, more efficient travel routes, and protection from things like bears and lions and other humans and fire and things like that. And modern Californians have also sought to remove chaparral from much of the landscape for many of the same reasons. And I want to make it clear that, you know, none of these are really right or wrong in any general sense, but the time, the place, the scale, and the intent really matter. And full and balanced consideration of the costs and benefits is important and necessary. Here are some examples from the literature of the many ways to destroy chaparral. It's actually, if you're like after a couple of glasses of wine and you want to have a good laugh, just get on there and look for like managing chaparral, destroying. There's incredible. The Forest Service published so much stuff between like 1950 and 70, which are like the most efficient mechanized ways to make that shit go away. Anyway, that's actually not really all that fun to do that, but you can do it. Number 8, there is actually such a thing as old growth chaparral. Even if managers used to laugh, and actually I think some continue to laugh at the mention of the term. And I define these as stands greater than 90 years of age, just that's because approximately the mean maximum fire return interval that one tends to find in the literature. And so I want to note a couple things though. Old growth is a thing and it deserves protection, but we do need to ask ourselves always, in all of these questions, where and for what purposes. For example, I mean, old growth chaparral actually is not especially biodiverse, except if you're talking about things like lichens and different types of soil biota, for example, okay? And in more productive sites, they're probably going to succeed to forest or woodland at some point, although that'll probably take a while to happen. Another important issue is, since the major threat to sites like this is fire, how do we protect sites like this without managing fuels around them? I don't know. I don't really have answers for those questions, but these are the kind of things that you need to consider when we're talking about, management of older stands. Okay, number 9, Coast Range landscape is dynamic and it is always changing. Burning, grazing, climate trends and cycles, demographic change, land use change, biological invasions, these things are unending. And what is chaparral today might not be tomorrow, or in 10 years, or in 20 years, or in 50 years. And it is true that modern fire frequencies are definitely a threat to extant chaparral stands in much of Southern California and in some of Central and Northern California. And in Central California, the problem is getting greater all the time. But the modern distribution of chaparral is very different from its distribution for the previous 12,000 years before Euro-Americans arrived on the scene. Native Americans, if you remember, burned Coast Range landscapes incessantly, promoting grasses, forbs, oak savanna, other things like that in the landscape. Sage scrub was also affected by this. It's a little bit more tolerant of disturbance, I think, generally, and it's also more ephemeral in the landscape, which is important to know. So you might be, if you're a strict restorationist, you might call for a return to the past. But the grasslands that are going to result from widespread restoration burning aren't going to be dominated by native species these days. There will be native species in there, but the dominants are going to be noxious weeds, right, largely. And they would be even more fire prone than chaparral, although maybe not quite as risky in terms of hazard to structures. Others call for even more stringent fire protection to better protect ecosystems and human communities, but how would we do that? I mean, if $3 billion a year isn't enough to erase fire from California, then what is exactly going to do that? And would we necessarily want that, right? I mean, productive shrubland sites, even in places like Southern California, if you don't ever burn them, they're actually going to become oak forest at some point. Not saying that's bad, that's not good, but I just want people to remember that things aren't static. So I'm just going to show a couple of examples of some of the dynamics that are in play here. First, this is Patrick's Point from Northern California. Some of you may know it. It's a little bit south of Eureka, where cessation of indigenous management led to loss of species-rich coastal grasslands and transition to sage scrub and conifer forest in less than 80 years. It's a really wet place, very productive. Then a little bit closer to us here, Vandenberg Air Force Base. This is near Point Arguello is the point I'm going to talk about. But Spanish missionaries in the mid-18th century described wildflower fields and literally the complete absence of woody plants in this entire area. Now, 253 years later, the landscape is almost uninterrupted shrublands. It is a completely different landscape that would not be recognized by the people who were there in 1769 or 1770. This is at Tajiguas Creek, which is just a little east of Gaviota. Spanish visitors here described a grass-covered landscape, and today the landscape is actually superficially quite similar. It's due to a long and continued history of grazing by cattle and sheep, as well as recent fire. But of course, biotic invasion has changed the composition of those grasslands by quite a bit. Here's another site. In this site, Juan Crespi described much of today's Camp Pendleton as frequently burned grass in 1769. Today, a lot of the undegraded vegetation on this landscape is sage scrub, but sheep, cattle, and bison grazing and periodic fires maintain an important component of grassland. So this is one that's changed not as much maybe as one and a little bit more than the other. And then here's another example from Northern California. This is work that Ashley Gruppenhoff is about ready to publish a paper from. And this is at the border of Yolo and Napa counties, and there's a UC Natural Reserve in this area called Coal Canyon, where burning over the last 2 decades has become common enough to seem almost Southern Californian. In Poudre Creek Canyon, the fire return interval since 2007 is 3 years, which is about the frequency that historians think Native Americans used fire in this landscape before the mid-19th century. So essentially, we are experimenting with a return to the past without knowing that we're conducting the experiment. This has reduced chaparral cover in the landscape by 60%, and it's actually reduced the density of oaks notably as well in the landscape. In many places, sage scrub rapidly invades grassland in the absence of disturbance, and it can just as quickly return to grassland after a few quickly recurring fires. This is a time series from the Santa Monica Mountains showing the advance of coyote brush over 4 decades without grazing or fire. There's some great examples in the Bay Area too. If you go over the hills from San Francisco east, you'll see coyote brush button right up against those fences where the cattle are, and then it's all grass from there on out. And then, here's a photo from the North Coast Range in a pretty productive area showing chaparral transitioning to woodland and forest in the long-term absence of disturbance. And then, of course, I have to include this. This is a graphic of vegetation change over time in Gaviota State Park from that classic study by Ray Calloway and Frank Davis. 31 years ago, Frank, at this point. One of the first papers I read when I moved back to California from South America, it got me really interested, and I actually did a paper kind of similar to it in the Bay Area, which doesn't get cited at all in Frank's paper. Of course, it's been cited thousands of times. But what we did was we just basically summarized the results from Frank's study to show how grassland, sage scrub, chaparral, and oak forest shift in dominance over time, and this is in the absence of disturbance, right? Even in the absence of disturbance, there's a lot of change going on in these landscapes. Basically between 47 and probably about 1960 or so, grassland dominated this site. Now it's the least common vegetation type on the landscape. At the beginning of this time series, coastal sage scrub and chaparral were the least common vegetation types, and currently they're the most common. And then their modeling based on the matrices they developed for transition suggests that oak, woodlands, and forest are going to dominate this landscape in the long term if it's never disturbed. I will note that they also did a matrix for having fire in the system and a matrix for having grassland in the system. And then finally, let's go to number 10. We need to make management decisions in chaparral and other landscapes based on transparent and fact-based assessments of costs and benefits in both the short and the long terms. And of course, stakeholders will always differ in their viewpoints, but we feel that basing the decision-making process on considerations of things like ecosystem services and their relative importance can really help to clarify and resolve conflict. The right answer for management in one place probably will not be the right answer in another place, and most management tools do have applications somewhere, oftentimes in concert with other management tools. And the Chaparral Symposium has actually always been about illuminating key questions related to sustainability and management of chaparral and seeking strategies to resolve those questions. In 2013, we focused on restoration of chaparral ecosystems. In 2015, we convened scientists, managers, economists, sociologists, and the public into consideration of the quote-unquote values of chaparral. And we summarized the key messages from the event in a book called Valuing Chaparral. This should be on your nightstand if it's not. If you care about chaparral from whatever viewpoint, we recommend highly that you read this book. It is dense and it is long, but it's available on Amazon, and the price keeps going down for some reason. Or you can get it from Springer, but I wouldn't go there because it'll be way too expensive. Here we've highlighted a chapter in which we specifically discuss how to balance competing priorities in using an ecosystem service framework and managing chaparral. And then, in 2018, we covered the vulnerability of chaparral ecosystems to global change. And then this year, after a 6-year hiatus, we are highlighting how better integrating science and stewardship can help to focus human and ecosystem resilience in chaparral landscapes. Okay, so that is our list of 10 things that we think you should know about chaparral. But you may actually have your own list, or you may want to develop your own list, and we'd like to invite you to contribute your own key things to know about chaparral to that flip chart over there. And it has little sticky things, so once we fill them, we can stick them on the wall and you can put other things. So, I mean, these could be things that you already know, answers you have, They could also be just questions that you have that you'd love to find out from other people what they know. I mean, we'll consolidate them here at some point and send out a collated list, later this spring or something. But it will also help to provide fodder for our next event when we do that. Okay, so thank you very much.